All righty. But I always add all the intro and things on, so we don't have to
Okay, well then I won't, I'll do the same. And how long do you want me to, how long shall I, well, you'll just, when you're done interviewing me, just let me know.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll say something about switching over, and then you can say like where to go to find your podcast kind of thing.
Okay, great.
All righty. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. And today on the podcast is a sociologist, a Mennonite. Conrad is on the podcast, and we are going to have some fun. Now, I think the important place to begin is for you to tell us all about your brand new project, because I'm going to be, when this comes out, I'm sending out a message about like the whole 5-volume set of the work you've been doing, and people are facing all sorts of big questions around the change and stuff facing the church and things. So as we're going to end up talking about it, but at the beginning, I think it's important to know where this is all coming from. Is a large ongoing project. It's being distributed in all sorts of ways. That's what ended up connecting us. So maybe tell us a bit about that, and then we can dig into to your scholarly work, your faith work, and how it all kind of the dots get connected.
Sure, Tripp. Thanks, first of all, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful to do this. This started for me 15 years ago. I was a Mennonite minister. I was also teaching full-time sociology, but out of the blue, our local congregation, which does not require a seminary degree, asked me to pastor. And so I stepped into the gap and did for 5 years. And then my denomination, Mennonite Church USA, asked me to do a survey, a profile of the denomination, which we had 35 years of data for. And when we were done, Tripp, it looked like all bad news. I mean, it just really looked like a mess. Declines, of course, in membership and attendance, the aging of the population, our youth leaving, systemic racism, and it was just a mess. And so I ran into Walter Brueggemann's work at that time for the first time. I'm a sociologist, I'm not a biblical scholar. And his work on Jeremiah and prophetic imagination just became the framework around which within which I placed the data for this mess. And I remember I was actually in the shower, Tripp, and I remember thinking, what if God's Spirit is dismantling this church because we've so failed God's mission to the world that God so loved and so loves still? What if God's taking the church apart? And I was looking for some eschatological hope here, Tripp, because it was such bad news. And so that question captured my attention then about 15 years ago. And then my second question was, if that's the case, if the Spirit of God is taking apart the church, how do we work with the Spirit rather than against the Spirit? How do we work with the Spirit's efforts rather than against? And when I was a kid, I don't know how I ever found it, but I found a little book by Judson Cornwall about Isaiah 40. Judson Cornwall is a Pentecostal pastor. I grew up a Mennonite kid in an Amish community. I had no idea what Pentecostalism was. I just knew that the imagination that Cornwall had for this grand excavation project in Isaiah 40, mountains lowered, valleys raised, rough places made plain, crooked places straight, grabbed my imagination. And I thought to myself as a kid, I can be part of this. I can be part of this grand story. I don't know where I'm going to fit, but God's inviting me into the story. And so in some ways it came full circle 15 years ago when I began to recognize that this work of dismantling was part of God's Spirit's work, part of that excavation project. And then it went dormant, Tripp, for about 13 years. And the congregation called my wife and I back to pastor. And I don't know who was a glutton for punishment, they or we, but we went back for 10 years. And as COVID got started, my local ministerium, which errs on the conservative side, kept arguing that we needed to come back to church, get back to church, get back to church, open the church, open the church. And I was so kind of pissed off one day that I wrote this little email to the church, our congregation, saying, you can't open the church. It was never closed. Like, you can't close the Church of Jesus Christ. This is an open, eternal thing. And that was the beginning of something that captured people's attention. And so I started doing a blog, and I'm really an introvert. And so this was unusual for me to show up on Facebook. My congregation didn't know what was happening. And I thought soon the language became, he's gone off the deep end, Tripp. So when I found that out, I entitled the next week's message, I've gone off the deep end. It's wonderful in here. Will you join me? And then I started podcasting. And and it took off. And I called it A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored. And that began what I think is, that's the ongoing project. I did about 280 episodes in 2 years, and then took a sabbatical from the college last fall and turned it into 4 books, a 4-book series called A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored.
And I think it's pretty interesting that it started with you saying yes, using your skills as a sociologist.
Yeah.
Right. Like religious groups do surveys all the time. And I'm having been on them on committees when they do them. The questions they decide to ask are pretty interesting. So it's always good news when you ask someone that knows what they're doing. And then when you look at data, it's very easy when you look at it to ask questions, assuming, right, like the world as it is, the system as it is, the institution as it is what we want to go well. So then how do we use the data, gain the data, work it to end up succeeding at what it is? So underneath that kind of initial invitation, well, what happened when you went in doing the data, wrestling with it, to then going, no, what if we need to dismantle the church? I mean, that can't be what they decide, what they were looking for. And it wasn't like you came in, guns a-blazing. So thinking of your own religious experience and then your work as a sociologist, how did that invitation to wrestle with the data turn into, actually, we might be working against God if we don't do the dismantling?
Well, I think part of it was Walt Brueggemann's work, that the work of the kingdom, and I love the way you say kingdom, but the gospel is really subversive work. And sometimes it appears to be working against God. But that's only because we don't have that prophetic imagination. And so here, this is an interesting story, Tripp. The denomination, I wrote some essays on the data at their request. And they saw it was a mess. And they came back to me and said, okay, we need you to tell us how to fix this mess now. And I said, let me pray about this a few days. And I took a few days and I came back and I said, first of all, this is not Anabaptist. This is not the fellowship of believers discerning together. And secondly, it's not an expert's role to fix the church. What I'm suggesting you do is go back, spend some time discerning together around scripture, in the Spirit's presence in prayer, how to respond to this. 1 month later, Tripp or so, they came out with a new proposal to centralize the church rather than decentralize it. It went over like a lead balloon. It exploded. The denomination only went further in its dismantling. So that's part of what got me to where I was then, recognizing that, in fact, so much of this is out of our hands. Sociologists talk about the sociological imagination, which is the macro level forces are pushing down on the micro level. And so much, we think we have control all the time, Tripp, but we, in so many ways, have so little control over what's happening.
I think that's a really helpful thing to note. So when you think of the kind of struggles, people of faith that are deeply committed and have been blessed in nice ways by their by the religious communities they're in, or the ones that they're vocationally leading. When you think of people in that situation, how do you frame introducing those macro level changes, right? Because I know a lot of ministers that feel like they're failing, and what they're dealing with is unrelated to their giftedness, their calling, and their ability. And I know a lot of people that are in churches where they see them shrinking and getting grayer and things, and go, I feel neglected and left behind, and that kind of thing. As a sociologist, how do you help people that aren't used to thinking about that big picture, see it and then reframe how you think about what's right in front of you?
Tripp, I think the only way to do it is approach through story and metaphor. I think that's where data fails us, because people were looking at the data, some of them saying that's not me, and then they come back to me a decade later and say, in fact, that was our church. So one of the gifts I would say that God has given me is that I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 6 years ago. And so at that point, the first year I was angry and pissed off and said, where are you, God? Why are you doing this? By the second year, I began to recognize that there was a gift in this dismantling, that my own body was being dismantled, but it began to focus me, Tripp. It began to focus my priorities. I knew I couldn't do everything with the time that I had left. And I began to find incredible hope. And so I have used that as a kind of prophetic metaphor for the church and saying, hey, wait a minute, we can go to pieces, but God is not finished with us. We remain in God's hand. And so that story of my own dismantling physically has seemed to be helpful to people who say, if you can find hope in the midst of this, then maybe the church can find hope in the midst of this. But I've got to say to you, and the webinar that I'm hosting on Friday is about those who've received this word and those who have not. I mean, it's like the sower and seed parable. There's a large bunch of people that don't want to hear this word, Tripp. And then there are folks who really do want to. And that's an interesting question for me that I've really wrestled with. Who's receiving this word and who's not?
Around the word specifically about the dismantling side.
Dismantling, which is really the gospel. It's the death and resurrection of Jesus. So when I talked to Walt Brueggemann about this, he says, look, why should we expect the church not to experience what Jesus Christ had experienced? That the death and resurrection experience to new life is what the church has to experience if its Lord experienced it. And so that, to me, it's the gospel message. And this excavation project, this dismantling project, is about taking apart or taking away, not destroying the church, but removing those cultural pieces that have gotten in the way of the church. And in very many ways, as I read your book last night, Deconstructing Jesus or Homebrewed Christianity, it's like the same work, but at a different kind of, I mean, I'm not a theologian, but you're doing it about Jesus, and I'm doing it saying, can we dismantle the church or participate with the Spirit's dismantling so that Jesus of the Gospels can be revealed to us?
And so when you said yes to returning to the congregation before, all the COVID stuff and then all the, kind of increased partisanship or kind of the politicization of, mask wearing, church attending and all that kind of stuff. Before that point, had you already kind of made the conceptual shift that both the dismantling of the church in the way it had been kind of formed and accommodated to our, to our culture and such, that dismantling was a necessary thing because that second element about then choosing to be an agent with the Spirit in doing it is, that's another kind of like tightening of the screw, right? Like to go like, okay, maybe we have to do this dismantling, but like saying I want to help it happens a different thing. That's like, the doctor's like, you should not have so many carbs and probably exercise more. But then there's like the actually cutting out pizza. It's like, had you already thought about that was that part of what you were saying yes to when you went back into congregational leadership?
Bingo, you're reading my mind. So yes, so Heidi and I went back into congregational ministry saying, we don't want any compensation. I'm blessed with a secure job at the college. I've been tenured and promoted. And so we want to come back and we want to try a missional experiment trip. Don't give us any money. Now, you can imagine that's the part they had the most trouble with. And cynically, from my perspective, it's because money controls, so if I'm not going to be paid, then how are we going to control you? But they did say yes. And so for 6 years out of the 10, we served with no compensation. And for 4 years, we got a small stipend. But our goal from the very beginning, Tripp, was to see if we could raise up leaders, equip leaders to all be ministers. Because I was watching churches in the Global South who were gaining traction in mission because everybody saw themselves as a minister. The credentialing was much less important, professionalization was much less important, but the call was important. And so that was our goal, to do this kind of experiment to see whether people could get engaged if they were seeing themselves. We tried to, what we said, Tripp, was we're trying to level the playing field between clergy and laity. And at the same time between community and church. Can we lower the barriers between community and church and laity and clergy to understand that we're all called into this ministry and mission of God? So yes, that was, we went in and very intentionally saying, can we work at this as an agent of the Spirit in this dismantling piece?
I think that's pretty gangster, to be like, no, I don't want to get paid. And I can imagine congregations not knowing what to do with it. It's almost as offensive as like thinking that your salary should like match inflation, or something like that. The but you talked about there, like thinking about the mission of the church, right? In part, part of what needs to be dismantled is so many of the unspoken assumptions, not that we say it, but that we act as if the mission of the church is, I don't know, handing the church off to the next generation so they can figure out how to do it, right? So underneath that, I think, is kind of an invitation to taking the mission as something that we all share in, and it's more than just preservation of institutions and congregations.
That's the gift of this period, is that the preservation, it ain't happening, Tripp. It's not going to happen. It's all around us that the preservation period is gone. I mean, we can't preserve if we want to at this point. We can't pay the salaries of pastors. We can't pay for the buildings anymore. So that's the gift of this moment. And so for me, COVID was also a gift for the church to be able to see into itself and say, what have we been doing all of these decades that we no longer need to do? That we can reset, we can reestablish a new way of being church and a new way of being engaged in God's mission. And so, yes. And I think in so many ways, just like the professionalization of the clergy, which is what I say, needs to be dismantled, so does the mission of the church as we've established it. Roland Allen was writing in the 1920s and 30s from Great Britain. He was a missionary who got tired of the professional mission program in India. And he was writing the same thing 100 years ago, that missionaries need to get out of their compounds and practice what the Apostle Paul did, was trust the Holy Spirit, go in, give the gospel, leave, and go to another place. But with modernity and the development of the modern world, we just build institutions. We've just been building institutions.
Mm-hmm. So when in thinking about the mission again, how do you think the institutionalization of the church has reshaped the mission? Like if we do the dismantling, there are things that have to be set aside, but also the mission has to get stated positively again. And one of the difficult things about our moment, and I'm sure you probably introduce these concepts and stuff in class, but like the question of God and religion's not the same as it used to be, right? So there's all the debates around secularization and that kind of thing, but also the level of religious pluralism is intense after 1,000 years or so of Christendom being in charge. There's so many different features of the lived experience of many congregants in the West that are just different than things before. How does that reshape the articulation of the mission when for so long the church's mission was tangled up with its kind of Christendom capture?
I don't know that we have the answer, Tripp. I don't have the answer, that's for sure, because Peter Berger says that if you're going to pass on the mission of a traditional society to the next generation, you've got to do it with all the agents of socialization speaking in one voice. Well, I talk to my kids and they talk about social media and their parents and their priests and pastors and coaches, all speaking different voices. And I say, how do you make a choice? And they say, well, we just kind of have to figure it out. And so the same is true for the mission of the church. I have worked hard with congregations over the last 15 years to define a corporate mission. And it's very hard to even think in that language. It's very hard to think about a shared mission, Tripp, for congregations, in part because they're going to church not for the mission, they're going for the pastor, they're going for the worship. So mission is almost nowhere on their list of reasons why they're going to that church. And often we're not living in the community where the church is even placed. And so space and land remains important to the mission of God. And so if we're not in the community, how do we gain a corporate mission when we're not even together? So I don't think mission can happen without community. And so until the church is forced to find community and develop community in genuine, authentic ways, I think we got no mission, Tripp. Well, we got a mission, but we're not practicing it.
Yeah. Well, that community bit, I think, is important. Do you think that, or how has the ability for us to form community changed in the last 100 years? I mean, lots of sociologists point out factors of like, growing loneliness and, the downgrading of institutions. You mentioned a great example about, of even your kids, like of all the kind of, I guess what used to be sacred canopies of sorts, different individuals and mentors are functioning with different ones. And then like, what do you do? When community is not something you're kind of born into and die with, and it's shared, what are the things we, or at least from your perspective as a sociologist, what are the ways community gets revisioned or explored anew when we can't assume the kind of inertia of a monolith?
Berger talks about two poles. One is the increase in individual freedom and individualism. The other is the community and conformity to the community. And he will argue that those are mutually exclusive. We are on a trajectory in the last 100 years where the individual is winning. So until that turns, Tripp, and there's no sign it's going to, until that turns back towards the community, until the individual begins to give up some of her or his freedom, our freedom, we're not going to gain community cohesiveness again. And so COVID was a perfect example. The mask mandate fight that happened in our congregation, the vaccine, all of that stuff was illustration that the church has become every bit as individualistic as a society around it. So if the church has lost its community, I don't know where they gather. I don't know how we put that back together, Tripp, is quite honestly my answer.
Yeah. I think that the idea that we would have even more to go before there's a turn towards the kind of communal pole is depressing. And what the interesting thing is the way in which in our present moment, we've generated through technology spaces where you kind of get half the buzz you get from a deep, rich community without all the awkwardness of being with humans. So like this past week, I was working on this, doing a training thing for Scottish Episcopal clergy around technology and faith formation and stuff like that. And one of the amazing things that kept coming back from these, having gone through the whole COVID experience from ministers, are how many people that went to their congregation that didn't start showing back up when they did, but they kept watching and everything online. And a couple of the ministers told stories of individuals in the congregation like, oh, it's just so much easier if I don't have to see so-and-so. And where, look, I don't really like the music. So online, I can just wait till you preach. And this kind of thing. And it really struck me. And one of the, analogies to it is when you look at like the youngest generation is the most successful at postponing sex and getting married and these kinds of things. And part of it is having been a college minister and now a professor, but also youth minister for a long time, is how many of them, like, why do you even go through the worries of having to deal with a person when, porn ends up being really available? Like there are all these places in our culture where you can find your tribe online, tweet with them, get all worked up and angry and stuff. And then you get the perks of community without the actual work that's involved in it, relationship, the perks of these other things without the work of relationship. Like you get your favorite part of the service without having to sit next to that other person. You know who they are, that kind of thing. And I want, when you talk about that it takes getting to an extreme where the shift goes, I'm like, oh, I don't even know if I want to see more energy towards individualization at this point.
I can only agree with you. I think that it would take a major economic, it would take a war. I don't know what it would take. We're in the middle. I'm sort of in the middle of one to turn us back. But what's interesting to me, Tripp, is I'm hearing my students more than ever before. I was in the middle of class a couple of weeks ago, and I realized that after masking my sabbatical and on, I didn't know my kids anymore. I didn't know their names. I couldn't put names to faces. Thought it was my Parkinson's disease, but it turns out it was just the masks. So I said, let's just take a break and go get coffee together and let's get to know each other again. And so we talked about what they're passionate about, what they care about. And I heard Tripp story after story from students, more than I've ever heard before, is I want to do something to help this world. I want to give something back. I mean, this generation, more than any before, since World War II, has gone through political polarization, the pandemic, this war. And my students were telling me, Tripp, before COVID, that when they would say, how are you doing to each other, it wasn't uncommon for the other person to say, I'm dead. I mean, the level of pessimism in this generation before COVID was just huge. School debt, am I going to get a job? Climate change, on and on and on. The infighting politically. But to hear them sit together and say, I'm thinking now about how I want to help. Maybe that's part of the answer, Tripp, is that I've always said we're never going to make any changes without suffering. We never change without suffering. We never change without coming to the end of ourselves. Suffering is the best teacher we have. And so I began to hear hope as I listened to my students talk about what they wanted to do with their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very good news to hear. And I think that I would be interested in you comparing that with the kind of conversations you have at the congregational level, right? And through this whole COVID experience, in the middle of it, you get the largest protest in America, all the Black Lives Matter protests during in 2020, followed by all the changes and responses that come. When you compare the two, kind of the two communities in a sense, like you're deeply on the ground with, what have been the points of synergy and contrast that were most enlightening for you gaining perspective about what's going on?
You know, I had someone email me months ago and say, it must be really hard to be a Christian in a secular classroom. And I said to myself, give me the classroom over the congregation any day of the week, because I'm in my college office now. This is a very compassionate place. We sailed through COVID. Students followed the mandates. Students did what they were required to do. We were able to focus on teaching. They adapted to the technology. All of those things were things that I didn't find happen in the congregation. One of the questions I begin to ask myself, Tripp, is this. We call discipleship catechism. We call discipleship baptism instruction, and we call it Sunday school. But we're not socializing our people as to how to live together in church. Mm-hmm. You know, it's all about beliefs. And I've started to say, I don't believe in belief statements anymore. You know, it's because they're not helping us. They are a rational way of dealing with, you know, if someone signs a covenant, then they're gonna behave well. Well, that's not true. So in my classroom, my students have been socialized since kindergarten as to how to behave in the classroom. And they're successful. But I'm beginning to wonder, how are we ever supposed to socialize? And I'm not talking about new Christians, Tripp. I'm talking about the 80-year-old who comes out of the pew after church and says, God told me you're to stop preaching about a church dismantled. I mean, that kind of thing, you know? Where have we missed it in understanding that discipleship is not just about what's in the head. It's not even just about what's in my heart. It's about what's in our community. And so when I ask Walter Brueggemann, Walter, why do you still love the church? Because he does. So I left ministry 2 months ago, pretty discouraged, pretty wounded. Working with Walter has been healing. I said, Walter, why do you still love the church? And he said, it carries the story. It carries the story. And for Walter, you never separate the story out from the community, Tripp. Mm-hmm. The community is, and not the virtual community, the lived, embodied community, the incarnated community is always where the mission happens and where the story happens. And so I don't think the virtual, it works to some degree, but it's not going to enable us to do mission together as an embodied community in the way that I think mission happens.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about those contrasts between the church community and in the classroom, and the way in which schools over time have, when you stay in them, you learn what it is to be at a school and how it is to learn, right, and all that kind of stuff. If you're thinking about that participating with the work of the Spirit in a process of dismantling and kind of reshuffling our focus and energies and things, what are the things to learn about learning or about formation if we're wanting a more embodied and communal expression? Now, maybe obviously some people may not want that, but if is as leaders, what's the invitation to these different kind of practice and learning and forming?
When I do a webinar like I'm going to do on Friday, I always start out by saying, Tripp, this is a classroom, not a church. This is a space where we together are here not to judge one another's opinion or perspective, but to learn together around the central question. And that's what I wish church was. I did a class in my sociology of religion class where I had everyone write their religious story, including those who were religious nuns, because you can't be in this country without having some religious story because you run into religion all the time. And what was amazing to me was there was this kid who said, I'm an atheist because I think everyone's a Trump supporter who's a Christian. But then he started listening to my evangelical kids and my Roman Catholic kids, and he heard their stories. And he said, I've got to rethink this. Maybe I could believe in God after all. And I thought, why can't we develop that kind of freedom in church where we have space just to hear our human stories? And that's why I love what you were writing in Homebrewed Christianity, because it was getting at that humanity, at the doubt that's seen in the Gospels, at the doubt you experienced, just that authenticity that is why Jesus came. I mean, it's why he came to be with us, to show us what it was, what the greatest authenticity of a human being could look like. And he hung out with everyone who, who he hung out with. So I'm not sure where I was going with that, Tripp, but I think having Parkinson's disease has enabled me in the classroom to move from being Professor Carnegie to an old guy who tremors on the outside with students who tremor on the inside. And that has created a human connection that is richer than any teaching experience I've had before, because they don't feel threatened by me. They feel, and I don't think we learn in a space that's not safe. So we go to church and we're wondering about what people are thinking about us, and pastors are wondering. I interviewed the former Christianity Today editor for my podcast. He said, every pastor knows that half your congregation you could lose with every sermon you preach. And that's just the reality. And so can we create a space that says, we're just human beings in search of the truth here, and we believe the truth is Jesus. But again, I love the way you put it. Beyond that, everything's up for grabs. But we're going to give each other space and grace. But I don't know how we get there, Tripp. I don't know how we get there.
And you've brought out like a number of places where your own experience with Parkinson's became like a space that you grew into new wisdom. And earlier in the conversation, you drew a connection to your initial learning of thinking about the church and you processing that dismantling with thinking of your own body. I wonder if if you follow the connection out, if there is a way that we withhold sharing and understanding wisdom as a church because we refuse to be honest about all the transitions and changes and struggles that are going on. And that if we were, then there's a kind of wisdom that can take place when you're honest about your frailty. And like a number of things pop to mind easily, but just watching at the indignance of so much of white Christianity during all the Black Lives Matter protests, that the people that were least likely to be present, engaged, the quickest ones to, move the signs and stop engaging once there's one bad news story or whatever, were white Christians in America. And as opposed to going, this experience shows us something that we have to admit is a struggle, a part of our brokenness, and something that this is not a life-giving thing we're carrying. And yet, what does wisdom look like if those are not things we hide, cover up, and defend ourselves from, but become spaces where wisdom fills it and it becomes a strength.
But who's caring about wisdom these days, Tripp? I mean, is wisdom in the language? I mean, I think it's a great question. I think, again, I'll tell you the story. It was the middle of COVID and I started preaching on racism. And I had no idea exactly where my people were until I started preaching on it. And I was really tremoring that morning because I was talking about the reconciliation that Christ brings, the tearing down of walls between Jew and Gentile, and the application of that to where we were as a country and race. And I was tremoring because I was anxious. I didn't know how this was going over. But we were outside for COVID, and suddenly "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" started to play from the chimes of the church next door. And it just renewed me with this energy to keep preaching. Like, one little word will fail them, and those demonic forces. And so I kept preaching. And afterward, one couple came up to me who was white and said, "We just felt condemned all morning." Another couple came up to me who was Black and said, "We had no idea you had the courage to preach that. You were so comforting to us. Thank you." And I was like, that's it. That's this incapacity to share our human stories with one another and to hear one another. And we're just living in different worlds. And so you're exactly right. Until we are open, authentic, and honest with one another about. So I've talked a lot in my books about my obsessive compulsive disorder and my struggle with terror of God's damnation all my life until about 2 years ago, until frankly I started podcasting. And it haunted me all the time. But that has been so freeing to other human beings who will write me and say, thank you. Thank you. I have this one chapter called "Just as I Am for the Great I Am." It's kind of it's looking at revival services where I was a kid and went up every service. And people I think wisdom, you're exactly right. Wisdom comes from hearing our authenticity and our humanness. And somehow we're really hold back on that.
You mentioned earlier conversations that you had with your kids. Good. I would love to hear how your own struggle in faith, the 2 stints in leadership in a congregational level, and go and kind of having this vision and mission that you're pursuing. The same time you're struggling with a diagnosis and things, like, how has that impacted the way you saw your role as a father and the gift you're wanting to give your children, be it in faith, in life, and looking at the world?
And when I'm sorry, when I'm saying my kids, I'm talking about my college kids in the classroom. Maybe you understood that. We have one son, Jacob, and 2 grandchildren. So I want to do the same for them. But I was referring mostly to what has happened for me in the classroom since this diagnosis, Tripp, is I do 2 things I didn't do before. One, Parkinson's disease has unfettered me. In some ways, I could give a damn what people say about me at this point in my life. At some point, I came to understand early in the diagnosis that, Conrad, if you don't become an authentic human being now, and if you continue to live conforming to all the expectations of everyone around you, you will never become an authentic human being. And Tripp, I have prayed for many years, God, do whatever you need to do in my life to make me who you created and called me to be, the most human you created me to be. And I figure now, if that meant getting Parkinson's disease, knowing I don't know how this is going to end, I'm still thankful, because it's been an avenue for me to, I think, find my humanity in new ways. But in the classroom, I do 2 things. I am freer about my faith than ever before. But this is the way I put it, Tripp. I will say this, students, I'm going to go down a theological trail right now. And I want you to know this just comes out of who I am. I'm not putting this on you. I'm not expecting you to buy this. I'm not trying to convert you. I'm just speaking out of my humanity, that I believe God has created you with a sacred story and with a purpose that God has for you to find. And I'm just here to help you call that out. I'm just here to help you figure that out. And the second thing I do is try to posture them towards asking the question, what kind of life do I want to live? We talked about sex a few weeks ago when the chapter on sexuality. And, I found out, Tripp, that 5 out of 30 students' parents had ever talked to them about sex. 25 had not. So I said, where are you getting this? Well, our friends and from social media and our school. And I said, yeah, the school teaches you how to have sex, but they don't say whether you should have sex or who you should have sex with or when you should have sex. And so we launched into a wonderfully rich conversation about decisions around sexuality. And I'm reading Anne Lamont's most recent book, and she's just vulnerable about her trauma and the way she became sober and the affairs she had during that time and her repentance. And so I brought her into the story, and they could identify with her. And so I'm just trying to posture them towards the question, what are my values? Because I'm convinced no one's asking them that question. Christian Smith of Notre Dame says the schools aren't asking them that question. And my kids that's in the classroom will say the same thing. We can't talk about what's right and wrong at school because parents will call in and complain. You need to censor this book. You need to censor that book. So my role, Tripp, is to say, this is my story. This is my song. I'm not expecting it to be yours, but I want to hear yours. And secondly, are you thinking about the kind of person you want to become? Those are the two things I'm trying to take into class.
Oh, I think that I would be thrilled to find out my child had a professor that was asking those type of questions. And I think underneath it is something we haven't figured out, right? Like part of that challenge of like a growing individualization in culture, part of that's connected to a virtue, like wanting to affirm the dignity of each other.
That's right.
In a pluralistic world.
That's right.
You don't want to prescribe in your articulation of the good life an outline for every other person. And so in a pluralistic age, that's difficult. That then there's no kind of, if using Peter Berger's words used earlier, like a sacred canopy we all share.
Right.
And so then where is it that the quest for the good life gets put? In the individual. Now, all of a sudden, the individual is now responsible for funding the whole story and all the language and everything for the good life. And I don't think people pick this up all the time. There's not another culture in human history where we told every individual, you're now responsible for all the questions of the good life. And because we're so affirming of pluralism, we're not going to have any civic institutions that actually cultivate us telling that story. Right. And so I think that yes, that's true. There's a virtue behind it. It also has horrible consequences because it's not like a big story we're all involved in doesn't creep in. It's just one where we outsource our values to a market. You can see the way it's impacting higher education. You mentioned the student debt crisis. Think of, I know I do these things and I'm at the University of Edinburgh, how much our hours are built towards granting things that give us money, recruiting students we know are going to take on debt. There's so many, the church is not significantly better than what the university is doing, because once you no longer how to have a question about good value, these type of things, what is a good life? How do we have a community of value and purpose and meaning and such? Then it gets occupied by other things we all share. And I think that to me is the space. If I think of a church dismantled, what is our task? For a long time in Christendom, it was like we were the place that came in after you've been convinced you're a sinner or whatever. Like, now you're forgiven. But now, I think there's so few communities where you get to ask the question of the good life. What does it mean to live a good life? And is it something we really want to postpone until some hypothetical retirement? Or is it something we can do in the midst? And I felt it uncomfortably when I've been a minister and in a university, how hard it is to do that well. Yeah. And when you read, I just finished earlier today reading the big biography of Cicero. And now he makes all these mistakes and is brilliant in these different ways and this whole thing. But no one gets done looking at his life and think, he had nothing he wanted to give himself to. That he had to decide how integrity worked in difficult, tricky situations based on where the power was going. But if you look at his life, there are threads of his deep commitment that are there. And it has me freaking out going, do I have those threads? Because like hypothetically I do, but I don't know if you told my story that like in the big moments of life transition, national calamity, all the way down to personal ones in your family, that you can weave those threads strong. And I like, oh, that's sad. Yeah, it was more violent. And there's plenty of other ugly things. But yeah, he has that line where he goes, death happens but once, let it still no other day. And I think that's like when you don't know how to have conversations of meaning, purpose, value, and you can't have it in a community that tells you who you are in a story where you're more than the buckets of genes and matter and things that you float around with. It's not surprising that our fear and anxiety overwhelm us. And sorry, that was a long aside, but I just finished the book, wonderful. 20 minutes before we got on here.
That was wonderful. You're doing some deep reading here. That was wonderful. And the project that I have them doing, Tripp, in the class is to take someone in their family tree born before 1950 and write their story. And if that person's living, they've got to interview them. I teach them how to do interviews. If they're not living, they do archival work. They interview family members. And the point is exactly what you made. What wisdom can they gather from those who've gone before them, who went through the Depression, who went through World War II, who fought through World War II? What wisdom can they gather, and helping them to piece together that a person's outcome in life isn't just coincidental or happenstance. Yes, there are many things we can't control. I mean, we know that as sociologists, but we still have some agency. Peter Berger says, if we never look up and see who's controlling us, if we never look up and look at the strings and who the puppeteers are, we'll never gain any freedom at all. And so helping my kids to see what are the constraints, what are the social controls that they can move against and renovate their life and learn from their grandparents, great-grandparents' experiences in that. And Tripp, they cry, they laugh, they smile when they give these presentations. They are so engaged in the story of the other that they would never have asked. I've had kids whose grandparents died a week or two after they interviewed them, and they were the last person to ask them about their story. We don't talk about stories anymore. We listen to stories. Yo-Yo Ma says, there's this amateur of cemeteries out there because we have a Spotify now, so people don't play music anymore. They just listen to music. The same is true. I think the same is true of the church. We just listen to sermons. We don't tell our own stories.
Yeah. No, I love that practice. When I run confirmation, one of the things the confirmands do, so these are like 16 to 18-year-olds, is schedule 3 sit downs with some mentor in the congregation and interview them about their whole life story, the role faith played, the hardest decisions, and all that kind of stuff. And then they make it a picture, an icon of the person, and have the symbols from different struggles and things. And then they tell the story to the group of someone in the congregation. And it's wonderful for the kids, right? Like, well, young adults that are doing it. But the biggest is the effect of the congregation, that all of a sudden, like, one, students show up at church with more necks to hug than they did before.
Amen.
And why do they hug that person and they get it back? Because they chose to spend 3 or 4 hours listening to their whole story and tell it. And so the elderly member feels confident. And guess what you learn when you have 4 hours without bullshit? Like, every human being that's lived that long has something beautiful to tell, and they're as feeble and broken as you are, which is good news. There's a reason we have confessions at the beginning of every service.
Yeah, amen.
And I think those storytelling things are so important. And at a time where our identities, like the identity culturally, is the religious identity is now downstream from political identities and partisan identities, and in ways it hasn't been in American history for quite a while. It is hard to disrupt the way we self-censor and pitch ourselves so that when we're in our religious community, we get affirmed. And underneath the way you accommodate to that community, what you're really saying is like, I don't know if I really, really belong here. So I'm going to share the parts of me that could belong here and hope that you'll pat me on the back, because the biggest worry is like, what happens if I'm honest and I don't fit, right? So the part of reintroducing thick storytelling is not, it's sentimental or just builds relationships, all that kind of stuff. Every time someone tells a full picture of themselves, it makes space for everyone else and the parts of them they don't get to share. And in some sense, a full story involves dismantling the kind of picture of yourself that you perform on a regular basis. Right.
It has to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's why the image of dismantling to the church is important. It's not a threat to the church's mission, but it is a threat to its cherished self-identity.
Yes.
And we think of whatever our denomination's heyday is, and we aren't there anymore.
And those who are holding up that identity, protecting that identity, and who, like King Hezekiah said, okay, the disaster's coming as long as it doesn't come in my lifetime. I'll be happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think for me, that's what Parkinson's has done. It's forced me, Tripp. I was living my life like a crazy man, but I wanted to end my career writing. I would never have stopped doing what I was doing had I not been forced to slow down and live a life that my body can handle. And so, dismantling is good news. I mean, it causes us to be still. When the mountains are falling into the sea, Psalm 46, and God's desolating the rest of the world by bringing shalom, just be still and let God do it. Just be still and know that I'm still God. But that's the hardest thing for us to do when things are falling to pieces. But it's in there that we also gain wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So now, for all of you that are listening, we're about to switch roles. Conrad's going to start asking me questions, and we're going to go over to your podcast feed. So I need you to tell everyone how to get there, because I already feel I don't want the energy to be dismantled in the conversation. But Conrad's going to tell you how to get there. I just want to make sure everyone knows you can check out the blog post for this episode. You'll get an email if you're on the email list with all the info about the Church Dismantled, the Kingdom Restored, the book series and things. And this Friday on April 1st, if you're listening the week this comes out, there's a webinar. And so all that will be on the blog post and in the email. But where is the podcast, Conrad, so we can send people that direction?
So you can access it through www.achurchdismantled.com.
Well, that's easy to remember since we've used the phrase quite a bit. It's
also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but it's a Church Dismantled is the name, and again, it's on all the major podcast carriers.
Mm-hmm. And you said you started the podcast, was it 2 or 3 years ago?
2 years ago, yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah. 2 years ago, not having no clue what I was doing, Tripp, and I'm still not sure I know what I'm doing, but. The winter before I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, I was reading a book by Barbara Haggerty. Oh, it's terrible. Life Reimagined. She used to be an NPR reporter, and it so captured my attention, imagination. She does this great storytelling, but also research on the brain of aging persons. And again, I didn't know my diagnosis. I was just starting to tremor. But one of the things that she says is that the brain, any aging brain, needs to do novel things. It needs to try new things. And so in some ways, the last 2 years for me have been a gift from God, because I'm trying all kinds of new stuff that I never tried before in my life and probably wouldn't have taken the risk to try. But by the time you're diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, you're down to 20 to 50% of your own natural dopamine. Well, that runs everything, and your serotonin levels and on and on. And so if you don't engage in new things, so I'm on medications that help produce and support that and artificial dopamine, but if you're not using your brain in new ways, you're just slipping downhill further and further and further. And so the gift of this has also been that my brain continues to be engaged in new ways with new people like yourself that are generative for me, that are life-giving for me. My work with Walt Brueggemann is incredibly life-giving for me right now. And so I just, that's just the story, a bit of it, how I got started, and the impact.
Awesome. Well, everyone listening, I encourage you to go to churchdismantled.com and find the fun. And once it's posted, I'll add it to the blog post for this too. So you can just click through if you're on one of those apps where all my links show up when you scroll underneath the play button. So thank you tons, Conrad. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to it. Whatever point we actually end up in the same place at the same time.
That'd be wonderful. Be part of the same community.
But yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I really love your passion, vulnerability and storytelling and stuff. And it's very hard